Welcome back, everybody. Just so that you're aware, picked up the Danish translation. So I'm tagging you now. Okay, let's open with a word of prayer. Holy God, we thank you. Your goodness towards us is great. As we see the events unfolding before our eyes, it's all too easy to become discouraged, to see no hope for the future. But help us never to forget what we already know, that the great controversy will come to an end, and that righteousness and goodness will triumph. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. I had a couple of other questions. One of them is something that I've spoken about before, which is, I guess, why the person is asking the question. I've spoken in connection with the Sunday law, the necessity of having the executive branch. What I mean by that is that to have a Sunday law dispensation, you're going to require a Republican executive branch. We already know the judiciary, the Supreme Court, is right-wing, is Republican, if I can say it that way. And Congress fluctuates every 2 years, as we all know, the lower house. So out of the three branches, one is already decided. And I've argued that in order to be successful, the executive branch must be conservative, it must be Republican. But the question is asking, if there's not going to be an amendment to the Constitution, which requires the executive branch, why does the executive branch need to be won by Republicans? This idea of the amendment of the Constitution or the speaking of a nation, these terms, these concepts that have been derived from Alan White, are crude and archaic. Crude means they're not very good, and archaic means they're old-fashioned. We have to take those concepts, which I still hold to, And we have to put them in a modern or 21st century framework. The questioner is reading the spirit of prophecy too literally. When you do that, you end up being forced to make naive conclusions. This is not some simple story about amending the Constitution. This is about the systematic undoing of civil rights. And despite all the election gerrymandering that's going on, the manipulation of the voting system, despite all of that, this, what we call Sunday law, will be ushered in under a democracy, under a democratic system. The system may be manipulated, it may be corrupted, it may be abused, manipulated, corrupted, abused. But nevertheless, it's still democratic. There's not going to be a fundamental change in the systems and institutions and governance in the United States. So we have to realize that this is not a simple issue that you can pick a sentence from inspiration and determine what the future is going to look like. You need someone who has the power to override Congress, which is the executive branch. Remember, the president has, or the executive branch has the ability to write executive orders. And we have discussed in the past that the United States, even though it professes to be a democracy, is in many ways a monarchy. The president of the United States has more power, more sweeping power than many monarchs today. It verges on dictatorship in its purest form. The ability of the leader of a country to forgive crimes without any justification, without any reason, is the definition of a dictatorship or a monarchy. And remember, there are no checks and balances on that power. Another question I've received is on marriage. Is marriage a civil contract, or is it a religious ceremony or a religious union? So the reason we talk in this framework about church and state, religion and civil society is because of the context of Revelation 13. The beast with two horns, church and state, and the principles in the Constitution to separate the powers of church and state. And because it's been drummed into us, that means we've been force-fed this dogma over the years as Adventists. As Americans, this idea that the separation of church and state is vital, is essential, becomes something of a dogma, of a systematic belief. But what we need to remember is, if you go back before sin, there was no demarcation between the state and the church. They were one entity. In heaven, there was no discussion about separation of church and state. It was a unified principle or idea. When the controversy began and Israel was created, they followed that same model of church and state combined. We're not discussing the reasons for that. But what we can observe is the effects. When you have church and state powers held by one person or one body, the high priest or the Sanhedrin, for example, there's only going to be one inevitable result, which is corruption. The abuse of power. To protect God's children, what God decided to do was the following: send God's people into the world under the protection of paganism. That was the safest way to take care of the church. And as we all know, Satan warps that system by taking over paganism. When I say paganism, I mean the state idea of that, pagan Rome. Maintains Rome and Christianizes it, bringing us back to the same model as ancient Israel, church and state combined. So, going back to the question about, is marriage a civil institution or something to do with religion? It's both. Because in its purest sense, there's no difference between religion and state. When we talk about the kingdom of heaven, we're talking about the government of heaven, not its religion. And there's an exchange between the individual and the kingdom or the state. The state has rules. And if the individual follows the rules, the individual receives protection from the state. So the reason a couple are required to marry in the eyes of the state it's a law, a rule, is to protect the state and to afford rights and privileges to the couple, which really means the individual. So whether we talk about heaven or earth, both have a state, a government, and the government needs to endorse or ratify or acknowledge the marriage. And we all know that the union of two people is a religious or a spiritual phenomena. Two independent beings become one flesh. So it's both church and state, both are required. Someone asked a question about child training. Because I brought it up recently. And without going into the details of the question, it's based upon a premise that, as the Bible in the King James says, using the rod or beating a child has some legitimacy, has some efficacy. And the questioner frames it in the sense of a certain time frame or age group for children where it becomes useful or effective. So again, this is one of those archaic ideas that we have picked up on because there's a verse in the Bible on this. And it's abused. Most civil societies in the world, the ones that are civilized, if I can say it that way, recognize that it's abuse to inflict physical pain or harm upon another human being. This is nothing but ageism. Ageism? Ageism is when we treat people of different age differently because of their age. Often when we think of ageism, we think about mistreating older people. But ageism works the other way around, how we treat younger people differently. And all the arguments that are used to beat children are the same arguments that men use to physically abuse women. Because the whole system that we have in the world, we'll just call it evolutionary biology, is based upon the premise that men and women are fundamentally different. And so in some shape or form, women are weaker, which is the same arguments that adults use in order to beat or smack children. That you can't reason with a child, so you should shake it or smack it. Or shout at it. And that same principle, those same ideas are brought into adult relationships. So I hope that answers those questions. I did have some other questions, but I'm not going to answer those. Recently, I posted an article on the media broadcast It was a New York Times article that was centered around International Women's Day a couple of days ago. The same article was posted on the Bible Study Forum for those who are on that forum. The second part of the title is called Avoiding the Patriarchy Trap. So the problem is the vast majority of us cannot avoid the patriarchy trap. You just can't avoid it. You will be ensnared in the trap. I just want to read a small segment from that article. And it's my hope that everybody has already read it, so you should be familiar with it. This is about a third of the way into the article. Question: why is gender inequality so persistent? The most obvious explanation is personal prejudice. Too many people still believe that women should restrict their lives. Restrict their lives to unpaid work in the home. And that people undervalue traits that are seen as feminine. And that men are uncomfortable with women in power. So there are three things that are spoken there. There are these three personal prejudices. Women should stay at home. feminine characteristics or those things that are attributed to women are weak, and it's not good to have women in positions of power. The author then goes on, remember this is an opinion piece, it's not news. And when anybody gives their opinion, it's subject to criticism or critique. So you may not agree with everything that is being said here. The author says, those three things are undoubtedly part of the story. I say those three things, but it's all about personal prejudice. That is part of the story. People are prejudiced. Men are prejudiced against women, for sure. But it misses the bigger systemic pattern. So, finished? So prejudice is only part of the story, but it's not the main part. There's an overarching problem. And the author believes it's the following. Patriarchy creates incentives and pressures that draft even the ideological unwilling to its cause. So I'll paraphrase that because someone might not be able to translate it. So patriarchy creates incentives and pressures. Incentives and pressures. In the English, it says that draft. The word draft means enforced conscription, like into an army, when you're forced to join something. And it says those people who are going to be forced to join the system remember a draft, some people like the draft and some people don't. But often the reason you have a draft is because because you ran out of volunteers. So the draft is really about conscripting unwilling participants. So then she speaks about the ideological unwilling. That means someone who in their belief system does not agree. So I'm going to read it again in English, and I've already paraphrased it in for the translator, so they don't have to translate if it's too complex. Patriarchy creates incentives and pressures that draft even the ideologically unwilling to its cause. So even if you don't like patriarchy, there will be incentives. That means like a bribe. There will be pressure that will force even those who don't believe in patriarchy, to participate in it. And when it says the unwilling, that's not just women, that's even men. Men and women who don't believe, who are opposed to patriarchy, are forced or bribed into participating into it. And I think we need to really understand that problem, that issue. Because many of us believe that we have now extricated ourselves, we have got out of that system and we are now free. That we're not prejudiced any longer. That we don't have racism or nationalism or ageism or sexism in our thinking. Even if you have achieved that high level of righteousness, patriarchy will bribe you and pressure you to bow to it. Just like Revelation 13 teaches. Whether the mark is in your forehead or in your hand, all have to bow to patriarchy. This is what the author is arguing. And I think we need to really understand our relationship to patriarchy and how and why each of us daily participates in it. One of the themes of questions that I get nowadays, all because I destroyed your image about the Levites, and everybody has been made unemployed now. We don't have a job, apparently. People ask, well, what are we supposed to be doing now? If you spend all of your day 24/7 meditating, being mindful, having a life of prayer on this issue, that you would continually examine yourself and see, recognize, and understand, why you're still promoting and participating in patriarchy. And when you're able to better and more objectively analyze what you do and how you think, you'll begin to reject the bribe, the incentive, and you'll be able to resist the pressure. Depending on what day it is, I have two thoughts. One, we do not believe that this is a serious issue, that equality is not the message of the hour, And that leads to a Laodicean condition. Or I have a completely different thought. We believe that we have arrived, that we are perfect, that we've come out of the system and we're no longer tainted by it. It's them and us. The poor them, the poor women, the bad them, the bad men. But we're not part of that. And that leads to a Laodicean condition. So whether or not you don't believe that this message is the message of the hour, or you believe that you have arrived and you're no longer part of the patriarchal system because you don't believe in it ideologically, whichever camp you are in, you're believing a lie. And each of us is in either one of those camps or both of those camps. It's a rare priest, very rare, that is really out of that system. Two reasons. We haven't seen the sinfulness of sin, and we haven't been doing this long enough. The whole subject of habit is something that we need to really get to grips with, ready to understand. And it's not as easy as these self-help books make it appear. The coding that's in your, not biologically in your DNA, but environmentally in your DNA, is so firmly entrenched, 30 days or 90 days of changing your habit won't change you. It's so deeply embedded in us, it's very difficult to eradicate. So she makes another really important point, I think. What's good about this article is that she uses parabolic methodology to explain her point. She discusses how a man and a female enter into a work relationship which morphs into a romantic relationship and into a codependency. They're dependent upon one another, a codependency. And despite them trying, or her trying, and in his own way, him trying, they enter into a patriarchal relationship because they're incentivized to do it and there are pressures that force it upon them. And I like this point now. Feminism and the release from patriarchal norms can benefit younger generations. So there's a straight acknowledgement that young people can come out of patriarchy. It can happen for them. But, and it's a big but, because it affects many of us in this movement. Because it depends how you define what young is. But for the generation of women caught in between, in the middle, this is to do with how long they've been in the system, basically their age. This transformation from patriarchy to feminism may represent genuine personal tragedy. This is the 21st century prophet repeating the words of Christ. What do you think I came for? To bring peace? No, I came to bring a sword. To separate familial relationships. Parents against children, brothers against sisters. The disintegration of the family unit. That's what the gospel does. It doesn't bring peace, it brings tragedy. And that's what she's speaking about. You go from patriarchy to feminism, from sin to righteousness. And what it creates is not peace and freedom. It can do for the younger ones to a degree. But for those women caught in between, the transformation from sin to righteousness doesn't bring happiness or peace or joy. What we would call the fruit of the Spirit. No, it brings personal tragedy. And I think we need to realize that. We'll say it another way, in more religious terms. This may not be that religious because I've forgotten the term I wanted to use. But the gospel doesn't bring peace, it brings pain. Reading on. So it's going to represent genuine personal tragedy, since or because they have paid the heavy price of an earlier patriarchal bargain. So when they were younger, they made a deal. We can say with a man, but it's not just with a man. They made a deal, these women, when they were younger, they made a deal with the system. The system bribed them. The system pressurized them. And they essentially were forced to comply. So they paid a heavy price before, when they went into an agreement or an alliance, or they struck a deal with patriarchy. So when you go into a deal, it's normally an exchange. The government has laws, and the deal is you live in the country, you keep the law, and the government will benefit you. That benefit can be many things. I'm not going to give examples. So there's an exchange. And that exchange means you have to give up something in order to receive something. In English, we call this give and take. Some people might call it compromise. The problem is, these women in the middle who are older than the younger ones, who struck a deal with patriarchy when they were young, they were bribed, they were pressurized to make that deal. They were promised something. It says these women caught in the middle are not able to cash in, that means receive the benefit, on its promised benefits. So it's like a marketing campaign. Patriarchy said, if you bow down to my system, you follow me, and they have a glossy brochure when they do their little talk, you'll be able to get all these benefits. But it's all a lie. Because these women caught in the middle have been waiting and waiting to receive the benefits, to cash in on the promissory note, and they got nothing. Because the system will not allow you to cash in to receive the benefits. And this is the result, what we're about to read. And this may surprise you if you're younger. And this will definitely surprise you if you're older. If you're one of these women. But think about this in your own experience and the experience of those around you. Those women, the ones in the middle, are often deeply opposed to feminism. In the movement, they won't say that, because you can't say it in the movement. Feminism has also incentives and pressures. You have to follow the rules to be in the movement. So no one can say they're opposed to feminism. Why are they opposed to it? Because they're fearful of the changes it can bring. And then she goes into another parable, another TV series. So what she says is this: if you're not caught up in the system and because you're young, you can escape. You can be a true feminist, if I can say it that way. If you're older and you have put yourself into bondage to patriarchy, because you were promised something when you were young, but you will never receive the benefits that were promised to you, you can end up being opposed to feminism because you're scared of the changes that it brings. And she goes on to discuss what those changes are. I'll quote again. If you're financially dependent and someone says to be a feminist, you have to fend for yourself, that means you have to take care of yourself. You have to have your own money, pay your own bills. That if you get divorced, your husband won't pay for child support. She says that's terrifying. That's the fear. The price that you have to pay. And when you're young and you haven't made a deal, I'm going to call it a deal with Satan. If you're not married yet, if you've got an education, you can escape the trap. But we have a large cohort of women in our movement. As she puts it, who are in the middle. And those women, they went into a deal with Satan when they were young. Because they were promised something. We'll call it protection. But they were never really protected. They were abused. And they want to get out of that system. But it's fearful. And the reason it's fearful is because they know, the men know, the system knows that they're not, and I say this carefully, I'm not saying literally, but the argument is that they're not capable of taking care of themselves. It's too late. They don't have the ability to take care of themselves independent of their husband. Now, you might think that this doesn't apply to you. And it may not. But this pattern shows up in subtle ways as well. She then goes on to explain other dynamics about the patriarchal system. Such as the pay gap. Such as even those women who aren't going to divorce and leave their husbands, how they're trapped in a system that promised them freedom, but actually gave them bondage and slavery. You all know the stories and the statistics. Women working full-time jobs, plus doing the vast majority of the household work. And the burden of childcare falls upon their shoulders. The problem is, even if a couple are both fully committed to equality, patriarchy will bribe you or pressure you to join it. And it's almost always centered around financial pressures. It's a good article. I recommend that you not just read it, but meditate upon some of the thoughts and ideas that are in here. I want to switch to another article now. And this one I sent earlier to the translator, so you've had an opportunity to translate it. So this one is a UK newspaper, The Guardian. The title is, "Who Made You King of Everything?" I like that title. For various reasons, but one of them is the following. Not only Americans, but we, the people, hold the United States as a virtuous nation, the epitome of righteousness. The glory of the world. But we've already discussed in today's presentation what's at the core of their institutional systems. The question that we could all legitimately ask to the president, whichever president it is, who made you a king of everything? And the answer is, we the people. The American people made that individual a king. They haven't had a queen yet. The point I want to make however virtuous we might think the United States is or isn't, it's a kingship. Now, if you trace back from the roots of the United States all the way through, maybe we'd pick it up in the 16th century, thereabouts. How did we get to where we are now? That we have a king. And depending on how you would want to argue this, that king is not only the king of the United States, that person is the king of the world. How did that happen? Was it some people behind closed doors, some clever white men scheming and planning to make themselves a king? I hope none of us believe that conspiracy. Because we already have inspiration telling us how it happened. How the people created a government of the people by the people. What we would hope would be a system based on equality and fairness. This teary-eyed high calling that Americans have about anybody can become a president. And what they don't tell you is that what they created was a system that pumps out kings every 4 years. And the reason why that's important to understand this article that I'm speaking about, and we've only just spoken about the title, I haven't posted on the media broadcast, but the article is really an interview of an author, a book author. And I've posted the book on the media broadcast. So I want to tie these things together. One of the major premises that the author has, Angela Sani, she's a British journalist, and her work is really dealing with the subject of patriarchy. Feminism, if you like. And her core argument, I hope you already understand and know what it is, because I've used the parable of the United States to explain it. We'll read in a minute what, how the interview goes and what she says. Americans, what did they want to do? They wanted to get away from a system that controlled them, that said, we have rules, laws that you will obey. but you can have no part in the making of those laws or the benefits of that society. Because you Americans are slaves. They didn't call them slaves. They said you're a colony, which is just as a code word for slaves. If you're white, you're on a colony. If you're black, you're a slave. Maybe that's too oversimplistic. So they said, we don't want to be slaves anymore. I mean, colonists. So we're going to reject the king of England. And we will create a country, a system that we won't have a king over us. That we will have a system of proportional representation. Although it's not very proportional. So that has never worked. And so this idea is born. Government of the people, that means the government comes from the people. By the people. The people put the government into power. And it all sounds beautiful and noble on paper. But what's the result of that? A couple of centuries later, we have a king that nobody could ever have imagined. And we all know the name of that king. The question is, if you have a good king, is that better than having a bad king? That's what we need to ask ourselves. Because going back to the previous passages that we read, this contract or this deal that you get into with the system promises you that you'll have a good and fair ruler. The king. Oh, I mean your husband. Because they're the same thing. And the problem is, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you're familiar with that term. All of those kings, when they get into power, they abuse it. There are incentives and there are pressures. Even good kings do bad things. Because you have a system that is corrupt at its very core. So it can never deliver on its promises. So the question is, how did Americans create a monarchy? We all know the answer to this. It was a mistake. It was an unanticipated consequence. They had the best intentions, but it went wrong. Could they have done something different? We don't have time to discuss that. But the point I want us to see in the parable of the United States is that it was an unintended consequence to have a king to have a monarchy in the very creation of a democracy. And I think each of us would be hard-pressed to create a system that wouldn't end up at the same place. So if what happened in the United States, which is a patriarchal system of government, and we realize that that was done unintentionally, it's a consequence of human relationships, if I can put it that way. Then we know that patriarchy, as we know, as we understand it, patriarchal system, is not a conspiracy created by men against women. It's not a premeditated thing in a way that many of us, many of the uninitiated, can be led to believe. And I want to make an important point. I think it's important. If we can understand what patriarchy is, that it's really having a king or a president, then the vice president, then the Speaker of the House, this chain of command, this structure, which almost always is a pyramidal structure, if that's what patriarchy is, then feminism is not women's rights. It includes that, but it's much broader. It's a much more important issue than just women's rights. It's a system of governance that is built upon diametrically opposed principles. Diametrically opposed to the patriarchal system of hierarchy. And what makes this difficult? This is the problem that the French had and the Americans. Is that in the creation of a society that is meant to be equal, you end up creating a system that is basically hierarchical. Because when you start trying to work out the details of organization, and giving people jobs in that structure. That structure, what we call the revolution, but we might want to call feminism. It's too easy to create a hierarchical system, which is a patriarchal system. And feminism is much more than just having women in power over men. Just as much as the patriarchal system is more than men having power over women. Because part of the patriarchal system is that strong men have power over weak men. And white men have power over black men. And young people abuse older people. Their age. So go ahead. I'm speaking about children when they abuse their elderly parents. These are all facets of the patriarchal system. And one thing that we need to be careful about is not substituting patriarchy for a matriarchal system or matriarchy. Because that would be the same as just having a female president. And we might think that having female leaders of government is good. And I'm not saying it's bad. Good to have women in positions of power. But all the examples we have are women who are perpetuating the current system, which is patriarchy. As a side point, because we're unemployed, apparently, we don't know what our job function is anymore, because there are no Levites. We have to be careful, and we have touched upon this before, about thinking the political system is going to save us. If we all entered into politics, we could change the world. We have enough female leaders in the world over the last 30 years that have shown it's not that easy. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the patriarchal system is strong and solid. I want to borrow another model from the United States, or another idea. That is of fragility. What do Americans in government keep on telling the world? Keep on telling themselves that America is the last great hope of the world. And it is. But they recognize that it's fragile. And it is. And so if the American model, the American system is so fragile, and it's the patriarchal model, just one of several of them, we'll give you three others: Russia, India, and China. They're all the same system, but they're all modeled differently. Every single one is fragile in its own unique way. And so what does that teach us? An important point. Something that I want us to go away and remember. Patriarchy is more fragile than you might think. It can be toppled. Toppled means dismantled. Prophecy teaches that it will be dismantled, toppled. So I'm just going to quote a little bit from this article. The author says the following. For me, it seemed less obvious that there was this one monolithic, conspiratorial, overarching plan. Monolithic, conspiratorial, overarching plan. A plan of male domination that somehow just swept the world in a very homogeneous or uniformed way. She says, it became clearer that there were different patriarchies, which means patriarchal systems, that took different forms in different times and places around the world. And I've addressed this point before, but in a different format, in a different guise. So there isn't this group of men coming together who made a plan 5,500 years ago that says we're going to create the patriarchal system and oppress women. And we're going to have a uniform template that everybody will follow. The patriarchy will be homogeneous. It will be the same everywhere across the world. This author, after doing diligent research, says no. What became clear as she looked at the evidence that there were different patriarchies, different forms, different times, different places. This you may not agree with. She says, patriarchy is not something that men did to women. at some point in history. But patriarchy is a fragile system whose continuation or perpetuation we all participate in every day. Men didn't come together and say, let's create a system that oppresses women. At some point back in history somewhere. But rather, it's a fragile system based upon negotiation and making deals, whose continuation we all participate in. So remember what we read earlier. Even those who don't want to participate in it end up getting bribed or pressured into doing it. She says this: I'm not saying that it's patriarchal to take your husband's name. You may not agree with that. She offers, as an example, that point. So she gives an example that it's not patriarchal to take your husband's name. But this is how, she doesn't say it's good. She explains it this way. This is one example. Now quoting. But that is one of the mundane ways, the boring ways, in which these systems stay alive. And there are thousands, if not millions of them, in cultures all over the world. There are a couple of points I want to tie together as we close now. Patriarchy is not a conspiracy that men invented against women. Creating a king of the United States was not intentional. With all the best wishes in the world, the system of organization that the Americans created created a king. Could we do a better job today? I'm sure we could, if we stuck to true principles. But many of us have not and don't want to, because we're fearful of the consequences. And there are many examples of how we all participate in the patriarchal system. All of us who are unwilling to do so. And there's a principle, an idea that's given in Inspiration, that says, do the work that lies nearest. Examine yourself to see if you are in the faith. Before we are ready to do a work at the loud cry, whatever that looks like, we need to be properly prepared. And I'm suggesting that the vast majority of us, if not all of us, are not prepared. We're all participating in the system because we like to or because we're forced to. And too many of us are not prepared to pay the price that the gospel demands of us. Let's close with prayer. Lord God, we want to thank you for giving us the truth, for exposing and laying bare our weaknesses and our faults. You consistently show us our weaknesses and our mistakes, because you love us. May each of us take up a work of examining ourselves, to understand how we are participating and supporting this wrong system. As we consider the glorious United States, help us to see how they made mistakes. So in our individual and our corporate lives, we don't repeat the mistakes. I pray for every member bowed before you, especially for those women in our movement who have been cheated, manipulated, and abused. By the men that claimed and bribed them that they would take care of them. May each of us understand the concepts of feminism, the beauty of equality. In Jesus' name, amen. I want to thank everybody. And that brings our Sabbath meetings to an end. God bless.
Donc voilà, comme notre ancien Parminder l'a dit, notre rencontre prend fin maintenant.
So as Elder Parminder was saying, our meeting is now finished.
Nous ne voulons pas manquer de vous remercier.
So we want to thank you.
L'ancien Parminder pour tous ses enseignements.
And thank Elder Parminder for all his teachings.
L'équipe technique.
The technical team.
Tous ceux et toutes celles qui ont pris part au programme.
All those who took part in the program.
Ainsi que chacun de vous pour votre présence.
And all of you for your presence.
Nous vous disons à très bientôt.
Thank you to all of you.
Et avant de nous quitter, je vous invite à activer vos caméras pour que nous puissions nous saluer.
And before leaving, I invite you to open your cameras so we can say hi. you.